So, well, welcome to the next Green and Tonic Climate Rockstars video. I'm here with an old friend and colleague, Paul Bodnar. Paul's had an amazing career in climate finance, even spending some time at the White House working with President Obama at one point, and now a managing director at the Rocky Mountain Institute. And I think, probably everybody knows, very much a key part of the America's Pledge initiative. And you probably heard me talk about this in some of my updates on the Global Climate Action Summit here in San Francisco. And if you want to know evidence of where we are, you can see the bridge in the background. So Paul, why is the GCAS, the Global Climate Action Summit, so important?
Anthony, where's my green and tonic, for starters?
Well, we have coffees, and I have bought you a latte, so there we go. It's as close as we're getting to a green and tonic.
Yeah, we're here in sunny San Francisco. There are lots and lots of climate crusaders running around town, and
they even built a polar bear out the front there. But
yeah, and it's sort of appropriate that we're in California, because California is definitely the epicenter of climate action in the United States. Just earlier this week, the governor of California signed an order that would make California the first truly carbon neutral jurisdiction in the world, and he signed into law 100% electricity, a clean electricity bill. So that's why we're here, and we're here partly because, let me tell you my perspective on it. I used to work for the federal government. I used to be part of the climate negotiations. And if you were part of the climate negotiations, or you've been to a COP, you know that there's a certain focus on national governments there. And I think traditionally throughout the whole process of negotiating the Framework Convention, Kyoto Protocol, Copenhagen, Paris, that whole story, the focus was very much on what national governments would do.
Yeah.
Right? And there was almost like this plexiglass dome over the negotiations, and you could have the world's most powerful CEOs or mayors or governors rushing to the COP to say important things, and no matter how fast they rushed or how big and powerful they would just bounce off that plexiglass dome. Because national governments kind of thought, this is our responsibility to deal with this problem. It's a big, important problem, and the bigger and the more important the global problem, the more it should be national governments that take responsibility for it. And in the United States, by necessity, we've had to take a different approach in the last couple of years under the Trump administration.
Because Trump's effectively disavowed climate action and the Paris Agreement itself.
Yeah, but what's interesting? We discovered something interesting. Even though we're making lemonade out of lemons, we kind of realized how delicious lemonade is. And
so you mean emissions reductions, clean technology?
Well, more the fact that we rediscovered ourselves, I think, a little bit as Americans, because we've realized that this is actually bottom-up action is the way we do things in this country. And it's not that we're here to try to fill a gap left by the federal government. That's not how the U.S. actually works.
That's actually how many countries operate, bottom up, ordinary people.
Yeah.
I spoke to one of our old colleagues and mentors, James Cameron, and he talked about, you create this framework, but it empowers enterprise with purpose, and just lets people get on with it.
Yeah, that's right. And that's easier to do today than it was 10 years ago, because clean energy is so cheap. So right now, going with the grain means going clean.
Yeah,
well, that wasn't true 10 years ago.
No, well, this is like the Carbon Tracker report, the Vision 2020, where you see the peak fossil fuels coming that we launched yesterday. We're at that economic tipping point.
That's right.
But isn't the problem, though, which is great and it's fantastic, and we will get there, we will get to a clean economy. But the question is, and the problem is, it's still not going to happen fast enough without some sort of policy support, some additional momentum.
Yeah. But the point is that if you think about who controls the factors that influence emissions, it's really to a large degree corporations, citizens, municipalities, and regions, not national governments sitting at the COP. So I think that's what we've discovered in the U.S., and we've just concluded for Mike Bloomberg and Jerry Brown, this America's Pledge.
So this is your nice little,
You've got your little commentary on Brexit here.
I have, yeah.
And I've got my commentary
let's not mention Brexit, but there are some interesting parallels between UK pulling out of Europe and the US pulling out of Paris. But so you've and this, you're one of the people behind this interesting report. I don't know if you can see this here. And this is being launched at the GCAS.
Yeah, so look at this picture. This is kind of symbolic. Here you have a concentrated solar plant. Lots of tiny little mirrors, each doing its part to concentrate power and get something done. So this is kind of the symbolism of what we're seeing in the U.S. You've got more than 3,000 states, cities, and businesses representing more than half the U.S. economy, $11.4 trillion of economic output, 178 million Americans living and working in states, cities, and businesses that have said, we're still in the Paris Agreement. We're still driving forward on climate action. More than half the U.S. So if that coalition of the willing were a country, it would be the third largest country in the world. And so what we do here is just say, hey, how far can we get without federal action? And it turns out much farther than we might think.
So I did a similar interview last week. Christiana Figueres, the former executive secretary of the UNFCCC, so someone who was instrumental, someone whose passion and drive, I think, helped us get climate optimism. I think she talks about get the Paris Agreement, and she talked about the fact that there was literally business leaders and municipal leaders from across the United States almost like banging down the door to get into the GCAS and make announcements, demonstrate to the world that what's the hashtag? We're still in.
We are still in. Also on your lapel.
Where can we get one of these?
I wouldn't want to say it on camera, but you can write me at americaspledge.com. Yeah, one thing though is it's pretty messy. At least with governments, there may be 190 whatever of them, but that's still a kind of tractable amount. You can put them all in one room. You can ask them what they're doing. You can have them report. It kind of is. It's not too complicated of a task to figure out global emissions and assign responsibility
and make declarations.
When you've got thousands and hundreds of thousands of actors, that is a lot of cats to herd, and it's kind of impossible to herd them. So, it's a different model, it's a different way of thinking about it, but it's actually more resilient to political change. At the.
It's a bit windy here. So
at the national level, in the U.S. we have these binary flips in elections between Republican and Democrat.
Yeah.
And if you actually build a bottom-up climate action coalition, you're more resilient to those kinds of flips at the federal level.
Okay. Well, after I finish wiping the coffee off my leg, that's blame the wind.
The wind's a little higher on the East Coast right now.
It is, yes. Well, that and that's quite a sobering thought. We have an incredibly powerful hurricane, yet another. And one in the let's not forget the one in the Pacific and the Philippines. So it kind of brings it home what we're up against.
So what's changed for you, would you say? I mean, you and I have been working on this for a long time in different guises, and we've tried to make a contribution. I mean, you were passionate about this when we first started working together more than 10 years ago. How's your outlook changed?
Well, it's one of those lifetime endeavors, and so I think you have your moments of pessimism. We all had that after Copenhagen. But you have your moments of optimism, and I think what I'm optimistic about now is the sort of stuff the Carbon Tracker does and analyzes and makes visible is we're at that economic tipping point. So you talked about going with the grain, and this is something we've been talking about, following up the DiCaprio funded the Vision 2020 report, the energy transition report, with something about going with the grain, that now policymakers, governments, politicians can make climate policy that is going with the grain, because it's going with the technological and economic grain. I mean, the technologies, the clean technologies are now better and they're cheaper and they're going to save people money. But there's a kind of, the problem though you have to get through now is a mindset You can present people with the reality. You can take the horse to water, you can't make it drink. So you've got to convince the policymakers and the decision makers that the world has changed. And that's actually harder than you think, but at least it has changed.
Yeah, I think in some ways. I mean, to me, the way I think about the difference between Copenhagen and Paris is not that there was some magical diplomatic technology in terms of the form of the agreement that we came up with in Paris, because it was actually very similar underpinnings structurally to Copenhagen. What changed between Copenhagen and Paris was the perceived self-interest of countries that they wanted to do this thing.
Yeah, I agree, but I think it was also, which is sort of related to that in Copenhagen, the politicians couldn't see how they were going to deliver. Whereas in that 5 years, it was 5 years, I hate getting numbers wrong, it was 5 years, between between 2009 and 2015, the technology scaled, the clean technology scaled up and the cost came down.
Yeah.
So, to the point where politicians could see how they were going to deliver, and that was critical. And as you say, feeds into also want to be part of that new technological industrial revolution.
Yeah, and what we learned from the Kyoto Protocol experience, and this might be controversial to European viewers, is that it doesn't really make a difference if an agreement is legally binding if countries don't see it as being in their self-interest to go along with that agreement. And what's different about Paris compared to Kyoto is that it's basically designed, it's a coordination system.
Yeah.
And it's designed, it only works if countries see it being in their self-interest. But think about not just technology developments, but air pollution in China. That was a big one.
Yeah.
The urban air pollution crisis definitely tipped the Chinese government into taking this issue seriously.
Does it matter to people in their daily lives?
But India is the perfect example. I mean, India for a long time had the position that it was unfair to ask developing countries to do clean energy because they were being asked to forego a cheaper enabler of economic development from which we, developed countries, had benefited. And in a matter of a couple of years, that story completely changed.
It's flipped.
And now 2/3 of Indian coal plants are uneconomic compared to renewable.
But there is this massive, what is now the barrier, and we're seeing this in Asia, is people are refusing to believe that. It takes time for people to accept the world has changed. It's something fundamental as coal is now more expensive than wind or solar.
Yeah,
and
that does make people sense.
That's the battle, and we've got to change. We've got to shift that mindset. So, do you think? And there's two things I want to talk about quickly to finish. Is how GCAS can contribute. I said earlier in a tweet and a video that success will be whether this captures the headlines around the world and is noticed, and it delivers momentum.
Yeah, summits are tricky things, right? What's the benefit of a summit? I think at the end of the day, you got to get the community of practice together every once in a while to energize each other, to provide confidence to each other, and to demonstrate to the people who are dipped a toe in that world, wow, this is really happening. There's a lot. It's hard to make it cohere, though, right? There's no Paris Agreement coming out of GCAS.
But it's got to create a zeitgeist. It's got to send a message, hasn't it? And I think that for me that'll be the measure of success. I mean, I think also the other, as you say, there's all these different communities, civil society, the NGOs, business, the diplomats and politicians. They're all doing their bit, and critically, the financial community. People always forget about the people who pay. Everything has to be financed, and as well as the politicians, I think, failing to understand this. The management of many companies are slow to change their view of the world. I was talking to Anne Simpson, who works at one of the biggest pension funds in the world, the other day, and you can watch that interview, that conversation, I should say. And her view was that ordinary people, like those who are probably watching this, like us, who have pensions, don't think about how we can use the pensions, where they're invested, and how you can speak to your asset manager, the person who manages your retirement account, to put pressure on those companies. Because, it's not just because it's morally the right thing to do, but because if you don't, you could lose money. Your pension would be worth less because you'll be invested in things that are just now uneconomic.
Yeah. And look, it's really hard to get people to pay attention to long-range structural changes, right? My first political science professor said, nothing concentrates the mind like the prospect of imminent violent death. And that's why the first multilateral agreements were nuclear arms agreements.
Yeah.
And here we're dealing with the proverbial frog boiling in the water issue. The frog will be boiled if the frog doesn't jump out. It just will. But it's hard to kind of notice, and there's other factors, and so that's what's really hard about this issue, and that's what makes it a fun issue to work on. This is, if it was easy stuff, it wouldn't be so fun to work on.
It's not a long issue. I feel like our kids. Well, I guess if our kids are still working on it, we fail. We have a problem. Yeah. So, just to wrap up here, what does success look like at the end of this week for GCAS?
Look, I think if there is a very powerful community now working on this issue worldwide, and if that community walks away from this meeting energized and ready to go back into battle around the world, then Jerry Brown will have succeeded in his swan song as governor.
Because of course it's the end of his government. It's the end of his term.
It's the end of his term.
Yeah.
And I think it'll be quite a contrast, don't you think, to go from San Francisco to Katowice, Poland, which is the heart of the Polish coal mining industry, and hosting this year's UN Climate Conference. So let's see if some of the spark from California can show up in the cloudy southern coal mining town of Poland.
Well, thank you, Paul. It's been a great conversation. I hope you enjoy it too. If you want to see more, there'll be more of these. Subscribe to the channel Green and Tonic. And you can also watch some of those other interviews I've mentioned with Christiana, James Cameron, and Anne Simpson, and some of my daily updates on the GCAS. So really enjoyed, and get involved. I'd love to hear your comments and feedback. So get involved, subscribe, and become part of this community. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Well, and maybe just a little look around San Francisco for those of you not able to be here, and the bridge at the back. Thanks.